Welcome to a crash course on field observations. And if you see that term field, it's pretty straightforward. It means that you're actually in the field. You're actually out doing something. Probably that guy or gal sitting there with a clipboard, and then you're probably, yep, you guessed it, observing some stuff. So let's talk about field observations in the area of research, okay? So to give you a quick introduction, there's a lot, but two big groups of field research. Typically the two most popular methods, and again, these have roots that kind of roll out. So let's just take the two big ones first. Direct observation, meaning essentially just watching, and sort of an engaged perspective, which would be asking questions. So direct observation is sitting there on the bench watching everything happen, or sometimes being a participant in it, right? And then the other section of it, or the other side, would be direct asking questions. You can get different kinds of results. Obviously, we know what qualitative and quantitative data is now, right? Qualitative, really more on the sort of first half of this course, right? And then the quantitative stuff, which you haven't gotten to yet, which is really sort of more on the analytic numbers side, right? So you haven't gotten that part yet, but you can get, based on what you're seeing and observing, either direct or through the questioning, you can get two types of data based on your field observation study. You're not necessarily required to have a precise or defined hypothesis to be tested. And this is why some folks in the research world are not huge fans of field observation, while other folks say it's the most pure of all research, because essentially what happens is you go and you observe, and as a result, what you observe becomes the study. Okay, as a doctoral student advisor, these are terrifying for us, and here's why. We don't know what you're going to uncover, and you don't know what you're going to uncover or view or whatever. And so as a result, the area of inquiry can be very, very broad, and it can also be disjointed. And as a result, you may be trying to make connections where connections don't exist. So things can get very, very messy very quickly. So sometimes having even a loosely defined hypothesis can be tested, or hopefully going to test some sort of a hypothesis, but it's not always the case. Odds are you're going to be going and trying to make sense of something that's an ongoing process. In reality, we learned about this about a week ago, right? You have a hunch about a phenomena that's occurring, and you are trying to identify that phenomenon, or maybe have a hypothesis, or you're testing it, or you want to observe it in action, whatever it is, okay? So topics of appropriate areas of field research, you might have something like your goal would be something to, hopefully comprehend some sort of perspective, maybe from one side or the other. Maybe you're trying to enhance validity. Usually what ends up happening is that you go directly to the phenomenon and you try to observe it as completely as possible. This could be something like a prison setting or a hospital setting. It could be a mental health facility. It could be the VA. It could be at a correctional office. It could be at a halfway house. It could be wherever, right? So you kind of fill in the blank of whatever the phenomenon is, right? Maybe you have a crazy mother-in-law, right? Narcissistic mother-in-law or father-in-law or whatever. And you go directly to the phenomena to observe it as completely as possible. So Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever it is, birthday party, that's where you go to observe this phenomenon. Now, hopefully that's not going to turn into your dissertation topic, but it does kind of have branches that can kind of reach out a little bit. So ideally, this is especially appropriate for topics that are understood in their most natural setting, meaning if you're going to interview prison guards, it might be more appropriate for you to, instead of interviewing them, actually observe them in their workplace. Similar with police officers, right? People are making assumptions based on what policing looks like. Wouldn't it be more appropriate for a researcher to actually go in a ride-along, right? So that's kind of the idea. So various roles of the observer. Okay, now remember, as the observer, you're the researcher, right? So you can be a complete participant. This means that you participate fully. Your true identity and your purposes of the study are not known to the subject, meaning you are, for example, your job is a prison guard, okay? And you're actually doing research, and you're just doing your job, You know, folks may not even know that you're a doctoral student or a researcher, a postdoctoral student, and you're doing research on that group. You're a complete participant, meaning you're actually in and engaged in the entire process, okay? Participant as observer. This is where you make known your position as a researcher and you participate within the group, but everyone knows that you're researching. This could be, think of folks sitting in a circle, right, with a psychologist, and everyone knows that the psychologist is a psychologist, but then they also know now that the psychologist is doing a research study as they're asking all of these questions. So participant as observer. Now the other part, you can kind of flip that. Observer as participant. Make known to your position as a researcher, but not actually participate. So this is different. So think of, I gave you the example of participant as observer. Folks are kind of in the circle and everyone's talking and sharing their stories, right? Observer as participant would be outside of that circle. So they step away from it, right? Everyone knows that this person is a researcher, but they're not actually contributing to the conversation. Maybe it's an AA meeting, for example, or something like that. So they're actually just watching everything. Everyone knows that that person is observing, but they're not actually participating in the conversation. They're not participating in whatever the activity is. Now, I'm just giving you just examples that are sort of pretty well known and kind of off the top of my head, but ones that I think that you will be able to kind of grasp. Now, the next one, complete observer. This is a person who is observing without becoming a participant. Again, this is a person who is sometimes not even in the room. It could be, I try to give a good example to students, and they always try to have a difficult time between the observer as participant and complete observer. So I'll give you one like a sleep study, right? Sleep study would be someone watching a baby who has sleep apnea, okay? Or a kid who has sleep apnea. And the complete observer is behind the glass watching this study, and the glass is mirrored and they can't see who's on the other side. So a complete and total observer, they do not become a participant, they not engage. There's really sort of a very almost a sort of Wizard of Oz shield behind folks where they're really just literally observing. Now, you don't have to be hidden. You could be sitting at the mall or wherever people go these days. I have no idea. I'm sure things are, whatever. But the complete observer doesn't necessarily need to be omniscient. They don't need to be hidden away behind a sheet or whatever. They could be in public, but again, completely unknown sometimes to participants that are in the study, okay? Now down here you're going to see that choosing the right role is relatively important. Now again, some students may look at this and not have any inclination or desire to do a study like this. Other students go, yeah, this is straight up real world, Dr. Rest. I could really use this information, and I think this might actually be my thread of how I want to go and engage. So that's totally fine. So choosing the right role. There is a trade-off, obviously, between the role of observers, especially as they have to adapt their ability to learn what they see. Researchers must think about these trade-offs. I want you to think about whatever study you're going to do. If you're going to do field research, put yourself in all of those different scenarios and think about what the pros and cons are of telling the group I'm doing research. Can that color the conversation? Can it change the conversation? Can you, by letting people know that they're going to be observed, will that change the research? And the almost undoubted, unfiltered, unfettered argument is yes, absolutely it will change it. I mean, on a molecular level, when things know that they're being observed, a lot of times they change, okay? Think about reactivity as well. This is when the subjects are affected by the role of the researcher. That's pretty important, right? So people know that they're being studied now, and so they change. I can't tell you how many folks, if you've ever been in a K-12 classroom, and they started doing the video recording of teachers for their TPA assessments, right? Teacher performance assessments. And when they started doing this, it's fascinating. As master teachers, you might see this stuff where this student teacher is doing great, they're doing great, they're doing great, they go great for weeks, and then they bring the camera in, they set it up on a tripod in the back of the class, and the class is hysteria. And the instructor goes, I have no idea. And so what we ended up doing with a lot of these instructors was we would say, hey, for the last week before you're going to record your official recording that you're going to submit for assessment, have the camera in the back of the class for a week. Students will get used to it the first day. They'll be a little squirrely, and then after a while they will kind of go back to their natural habitat, and they will kind of forget that the camera's there. So a lot of times I tell researchers this as well. Sometimes your initial viewing or your initial data gathering sometimes is just you acculturating, meaning folks are going to get acculturated and accustomed to you being in that room. And then after maybe a day or 2 or 3, now you don't obviously have that much time. So sometimes what I do is I start the conversation, especially when you're going to be throwing questions sometimes that are sensitive. You save those for the end, right? You get those, you don't hit them sort of in the mouth with all the difficult stuff right off the bat. You work up to it. You have conversations. You kind of break the ice. You have everybody feel comfortable, and then you can kind of get into the more difficult stuff. Again, be thinking about different situations requiring different roles. I gave you a ton of different examples. You can kind of see how they could all bounce around from one to the other. So here's an example. This is Dr. James, right? He's a nationally renowned expert on prisons. He conducted a participant observation study. Now you can kind of think about that. Participant observation study, and you're like, okay, I gotta go back to my slides, Dr. S. Okay, participant observation study. Which one was that, right? And you can kind of go back to your slide and then figure out, I think it's on slide 4, what that means, right? When he became a full-time prison guard, now think about that for a second. He's a professor, right? But he became a full-time prison guard to study the practice of using aggressive inmates to control other inmates, okay? His role in the study was partially complete participant. Now, what does that term complete participant mean? Remember? Here's complete participant. Participates fully. The true identity and purpose of the researcher is not known to the subjects. So again, Dr. James, he was not known to the subjects. The other folks just assumed this guy is a prison guard, right? Now, this is going kind of pretty deep, and I don't expect my students to do this stuff, but this is what I'm talking about when you go postdoctoral and you start to get into your research beyond just the research part of just publishing a paper. This is what we're talking about. So his role in the study was partially complete participant. Now, that's kind of confusing, I can see that. Because some guards did not know he was a sociologist studying prison behaviors. What does that mean? That means some guards did know because they put him into a situation where obviously he's not a real prison guard. So they need to put him in situations with other prison guards that know he is not necessarily completely trained to handle some of these difficult situations. So we're going to put him with these other people that can step in if they need to, whereas a lot of the other guards may not know anything. And so they will treat him a certain way. The prisoners will treat him a certain way, and so on. So, okay, going back to the scenario here. Sociologists studying prison behaviors and part participant as observer because the warden and some of the guards, again, were aware that he was conducting the research. So he is sort of a blur between this participant observation, right? He was getting into a mix between complete participant, again, here's the term complete participant, and participant as observer. And the reason I do this and I show you this example, which is pretty messy, is because I think it shines a little bit of light on what is possible if you were doing a research study. Again, these are pretty messy ones, but again, for purposes of the explanation, right? So let's go down a little bit more. Let's talk a little bit about these cases for observation. So you can have something called snowball sampling, which makes sense. You can sample and all of a sudden you get a little bit more, and you get a little bit more, and you get a little bit more. And then as you start to ask questions, the sample size gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You got to consider potential selection bias as well. If you sit at a certain mall in Orange County or whatever, you're going to get a certain population. If you sit at a certain mall or a grocery store at this time, you're probably going to get a certain population, right? So be thinking about possible uses of probability sampling as well. Think about purposeful or purposive sampling. Consider variations in observation to consider what, here's some things to kind of think about when you're considering your sampling. The population you're going to look at, the space that you're going to be in, the time, if it's going to be a micro or a macro time, the weather, right? You'd be surprised, right? If you're going to be observing something outside, people will act differently. If you're observing California traffic, for example, and you're doing it on a rainy day, it's going to be different than it would be on a sunny day. It would be different on a Friday morning, Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday night, right? Recording observations. So various methods for recording observations. There's a bunch of them. The text is going to go through a few more as well. They go from everything from pen and paper to video recording and kind of everything in between. I strongly encourage folks, if they can, video record with permission, especially if you're doing a lot of observations. That's a great idea. Sometimes video recording is impossible because it immediately lets everyone know that they're being recorded, and so observations and activities can change. Be thinking about the methods that you select if you're going to be recording, if they're related to issues of measurement as well, from certain angles, certain things that you can and can't see. I always tell folks it's sort of like instant replay, right? Certain angles looks like certain things happen, but there's no perspective in recording, meaning if something looks like something touched something and you're recording it from the front to the back, if you turn the camera at a different angle, it could be 5 or 7 feet away, and the hand is just right in front of or behind someone's face. But if you put the camera just right, it looks like it's slapping them in the face, and that's not necessarily the case, right? Maybe they're shooing a fly away or something. So you have to have certain perspectives as well. People who have, if they're going to be recording someone's facial expressions, you need to know what's in front of their face that's causing typically that facial expression. So a lot of those kinds of things that some people wouldn't consider, they just assume, I'll put the camera here. Be thinking about what you're recording, and then also, if there's going to be some sort of bias in the way that that's going to be recorded. I strongly encourage students not to trust their memory. Our memories lie to us. We have information, we think we know what happened, and then we will fill in the blanks. Our brains do a good job of filling in the story of what occurred as well. This happens a lot in litigation. Attorneys try to do that where they have 2 or 3 pieces of information, and then they try to get the jury or consensus of a community to fill in the blank. What do you think happened by this, right? Only one logical explanation could have been from like this to this, right? This person purchased a firearm, and then the next week this person was dead, right? And it's like, well, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that someone committed murder. It just means that they purchased a firearm, right? So rational questions, typically you don't want researchers on your on your jury because they ask too many questions, right? There's too many assumptions. So think about the way that your memory works and try not to trust your memory. And then try to take your notes in stages as well. Try to chunk things out. Remember, as you're writing, if you're observing, when you're writing, you're no longer observing. Think about that for a second. When you're writing, you're no longer observing. And so if you can record, that's better because you can record, pause, make notes, and then move on to the next part. Again, if you're taking notes, you're not observing, you're taking notes. Try to do the best you can to note everything that seems important, and things sometimes that do not seem important at the time, you may want to observe that as well. You'd be so surprised just based on the way that you ask a certain question. If you got the cameras in just the right way and you ask a question and you look at facial expressions, you might be recording, or you could tell the group, maybe you're going to use some deception and you're going to be asking them questions, but what you're really doing is just looking at their facial expressions based on what questions you're asking, right? And then someone's feeding you information. You've got a panel of 10 people, you ask them a question about a childhood trauma, and one person's facial expression winces, right? They kind of grimace a little bit. Someone in your ear who's observing that from a different camera somewhere else tells you in your ear, hey, ask participant number 7 how they felt about this, right? So that's where you can kind of have a little bit more in-depth observation, but again, the recording can be beneficial. But the thing to take away from this slide is don't trust your memory. Okay, so structured observations. Deep breath. This is going to be where the observer makes marks on a closed-end questionnaire. So you've got a questionnaire, and you're actually taking some notes. This is the clipboard style, okay? Training for this is extensive. It can be time-consuming. It can have a higher reliability than some other, studies can. Examples might be something like an environmental survey. So observers record information about conditions of a specific environment, and so they're literally just recording. Data is getting inputted, right? There's a safety audit, types of environmental survey that focuses on security and safety of places. Obviously, people who are familiar with OSHA, for example, right, and having a safety audit, right? My wife, the pediatric dentist, will have insurance companies come out and they'll do an audit, not just based on how they bill and all that kind of stuff, but also the environmental organization, right? Now, obviously, OSHA is going to take care of some of that stuff, but the insurance companies may be taking a look at the way that they're just beyond billing, if they have certain things up posted, if they're how they're communicating to patients, and so on. So there's an audit of those things as well. Again, structured observation, they've got a clipboard, they're filling things out, they've got a series of questions, and they're making notations on that form. Now, strengths and weaknesses, I told you that I'm always going to be the person that's going to punch holes in even my own theories, right? As a researcher, you kind of have to. If I'm gung-ho and I say this is the best thing ever, odds are I'm probably selling you something. So let's poke some holes in this. Strengths and weaknesses of field observation. Some strengths. The chief strength is that it gives you a deep understanding of what's going on. You can go, instead of skimming the surface, you can really dive into the phenomena that's occurring. It's also relatively flexible. You can tweak and adjust. You can go and sit and observe a daycare and see what's going on, right? You can step away, you can have cameras set up and then be viewing it that way. You could sit down on the floor with the kiddos and have a conversation with kids and talk about their favorite toys or whatever. So people can know that they're being observed or researched. But you can also step away and then be behind the veil and get research that way as well. Especially if maybe you're telling a researcher or people that you're going to be participating in. So let's take that daycare scenario for example, right? Even though we're talking about public admin, but we're going to give you the daycare scenario. You could go in and have some deception, and you could tell the daycare workers that we're here to observe the kids, and you filled out this form and blah blah blah, and any data that we collect may go into our study, including some in a fine print, something about researchers observing all participants in the room, which includes people, right? You can tell the researchers can communicate that. And then you could say, I'm going to be reviewing, and we're going to be looking at children and the way that they interact with books versus media versus anything with a battery in the activity room, right? And really what you're researching is the employees and how often they go to, grabbing a book, grabbing a digital media, or grabbing some sort of a battery activity toy and then handing out to students. And if there's any correlation with certain types of employees giving certain types of toys or whatever it is, right? So if that's the case, then you can have some flexibility there because you could participate, you could not participate, you could be in the room, you could be known to the group, you could be known and unknown to the group, meaning some people like the owner of the daycare could say, yeah, I know that you're doing research on my employees, I want to know who's a good employee and who's not. And so you could have a lot of this flexibility in the way that this research is being conducted. There's also some weaknesses. Usually, it doesn't yield precise descriptive statements. You can't get generalizable descriptive data about a large population. Usually what you're getting is something that is for a small group that you can pinpoint, okay, at this prison in Southern California, under these conditions, this occurred. And you essentially just are stating this is what happened. But you're not necessarily saying, in all prisons, in this type of a scenario, this will occur. And so that's a weakness of it, is that sometimes you can't generalize the information. Now, again, we've talked about this in the past. Sometimes you don't want to generalize your information. Sometimes you just want to report what's going on. Next, for weaknesses is precise probability samples cannot normally be drawn. And again, this is just going back to your generalizability. You can't take and predict something, okay, every time this occurs, this will probably occur as well. Where you could, if you had a larger sampling, or if you had sort of a more of a quantitative study across the country, across the world, and you had 100,000 participants across various spectrums, you could probably make some probability samples, meaning you could actually say, okay, based on the next 100,000 people we survey, we should get about this many people responding this way, or whatever. Or if we change this variable, this is probably the outcome we'll get. So again, another weakness, and it fits into that same section of the descriptive statements. You can't go and generalize a lot of information, but again, maybe that's not your goal, and so the weakness you can kind of push off to the side because the strengths outweigh the weaknesses. Or if you're trying to find something that's more generalizable, like the prison study, for example, you have to be really careful with the participants that you're going to have. Is it, did it only work because that one participant that they had was such a remarkable character that people listened to that person, and as a result, it worked. But then if you remove that one remarkable character remarkable participant who has such respect from all of the other inmates, and that person gets removed, does this whole thing fall apart? And so you can kind of ask questions like that as well. Finally, the hardest part of research and your methods will be validity and reliability. Is the measurement tool that you have valid? Meaning, has it been vetted and people agree that, yeah, this is the question that you're asking is, the question that you're asking, and you're getting the information that the question is seeking. And another way of saying that would be, for validity, is the assessment accurate? Is it an accurate measure of what you're trying to assess? Reliability means, can it be replicated? Can someone else, not you, based on your recipe, translation recipe, meaning your methods, right? Your step-by-step methods. Can someone replicate what you just did without you and get the same results? And if so, if you've got an accurate measure and you have a reliable measure, then ideally your study is valid and it's reliable. That usually means it's replicated and it's generalizable, okay? So observations are usually strong in validity. And problems can occur when subjects are aware of the researcher's role. We've talked about this. If people know who you are, they know what's going on, they can create challenges in your research, especially in field research. Reviewing field notes and interviewing transcripts can really help improve your validity. What I mean by that is, once you have your notes and you've gone through your transcripts, go through them a couple of times, not just one read, and look for similarities, differences. We talked about coding and nodes, so look for those things that you can kind of clump together and group based on themes. You can have some potential problems as well as reliability. We talked about the reliability issues, and that's going to go back to your descriptive information. It's also going to be your generalizability and someone being able to replicate what you just did, right? The interpretation of observations might vary by observer, meaning if you had different observers and they saw different things, they may pick up on different things, right? Most obvious, right? A mom who is watching a room full of children will have different observable characteristics and traits that she'll pick up on with kids than someone maybe who doesn't have kids, right? And so that's really interesting to think about, that your observer might actually be different based on their own personal bias and experiences. You'll see these parents that they'll stand up and start walking towards kids before the kid hits someone else because they know what's going to happen, right? Next part, reliability can be improved through careful attention to the detail of observation. And then finally, as I've hinted at and kind of thrown around, generalizability is often a problem. So that's what you've got for, and then here's the references just in case from the Babby text for field observations. Again, folks, I pray that this information is helpful. Just a quick overview. I hope that this information is kind of clarifying to some folks as well. Again, we don't go into super detail here. It's just kind of a survey to kind of give you enough information to be dangerous as you're getting into the text and the remainder of the content this week. So God bless, folks. And then if you have questions, reach out.